I was afraid I was going to have to break up the California reunion here.
We were not in that.
Well, I guess the certain California reunion. We ready to go? All right. So we are in Hebrews chapter 3. We're going to pick up in verse 16. We kind of left off in the middle of a point, but the point that we're in the middle of is a really long one. So hopefully we can wrap it up today, but I'm not terribly optimistic. The point that we're building off of, the Hebrew author quotes Psalm 95 in chapter 3, verse 7. Beginning in verse 7, he's quoting the whole second half of the 95th Psalm, and they use points out of this to build on almost through the end of chapter 4. So let's reread that quote in Hebrews chapter 3, beginning in verse 7. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tested me, tried me, and saw my works 40 years. Therefore, I was angry with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. So here we have David in Psalm 95, 450 years after the Israelites are led out of Egypt, talking about how the people were rebellious. They wouldn't listen to God. They tried to turn back. And God then said in verse 11, I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. So we've been looking at that. The author, what we looked at last week, the author warns about turning back. The author warns against being caught up in sin, being deceived by sin, and participating in that same sort of rebellion that the Israelites who came out of Egypt participated in. So when we pick up in verse 16, it starts with the word for. One of those transition words that we don't want to gloss over. Let's go back to verse 14 to see what he's referencing. Verse 14 says, for if we've become partakers of Christ, we have become partakers of Christ, if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. If we stay steadfast, if we maintain that confidence, then we're partakers with Christ. And remember, that word partakers really just means fellowship. We're in fellowship if we remain faithful. And then we pick up in verse 16 of chapter 3. For who, having heard, rebelled? Indeed, was it not all who came out of Egypt led by Moses? Now with whom was he angry 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who did not obey? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. So he's wrapping up that point about rebellion, using the Israelites who came out of Egypt as an example from that quote in Psalm 95. So, verse 16, for who rebelled? The Israelites who left Egypt. How many people is, which portion of them?
The initial generation.
But which portion of them? Of that initial generation who left Egypt, it says in verse 16, who rebelled? He says all. Roger's being technical. All but two. Remember? Oh, who said all but two? Oh, it was Dave, one of the elders. All but two. Caleb and Joshua were the only two who left Egypt, who got to go into Israel. Now, of those who fell in the wilderness, that includes Moses, that includes Aaron, right? So when we say all who left Egypt, except two, didn't get to go into Israel, how many people is that? So remember, they numbered the men as they left Egypt, and it was roughly 600,000 fighting men. Now, if you take that and say maybe of the family, you've got older men, you've got kids, you've got women, maybe the number is like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 would have been that number of fighting men. So we're talking about, of 600,000 fighting men, we're talking about a nation of 2.5 to 3 million people. What's that percentage? 2 out of 2.5 to 3 million people didn't realize the promise that God gave them. It's less than 1%. It's a little bit of a scary number. And we'll look, we actually use that word fear here in a minute. So, who having heard rebelled? All of them. Now, with whom was he angry for 40 years? Everyone who sinned. How many who sinned? Or how many sinned? It was all of them. And to whom did he swear that they wouldn't enter his rest? It was those who didn't obey, which again is all of them. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. So what is that unbelief? Did they believe in God? Yeah. Was it easy for them to believe in God? I get a couple of these and I get a couple of these. Remember what these people have seen. They experienced the plagues, or they saw the plagues. They saw God throw up a big wall of fire so that the Egyptian army couldn't get to them. They were able to see the sea parted so they could walk through on dry land. They were there at Sinai when the law was given. They had a physical manifestation while they were in the wilderness that they could point at and say, that pillar of fire or that pillar of cloud references God, is a manifestation of God. And I can point at it right now. Did they believe in God? Yeah. Why didn't they get to enter into that rest? Sorry, I can't hear through the mask. Disobedience. We look at verses 16 through 19 here at the end of chapter 3, remind me of Hebrew poetry. Now remember, Hebrew poetry is not necessarily where the words rhyme, but where the thoughts rhyme. So this word unbelief that we see in verse 19 ties back to verse 18 where it says they did not obey. Or you may have the word disobedience, which ties back to verse 17 where we have the word sin, which goes back to verse 16 where we have the word rebel. So this unbelief is the same as disobedience, which is the same as sin, which is the same as rebellion. And that's what they did. Roger.
And its origin really is in 12, an evil, unbelieving heart.
Yeah. And so disbelief in God is tied to the word evil. These thoughts are all building up to on one on top of the other, and they all kind of rhyme. The words that they're using, the meaning of the words rhyme. So, what's the application for the recipients of the Hebrew letter, and therefore what's the application for us?
Obey, believe, so you can enter God's rest.
Okay, we've got that promised rest too, right? Otherwise, the writer in Hebrews wouldn't be quoting David, who's referencing the Israelites leaving Egypt. We have that same promise of rest. Are we at the same risk that 99.9999999% of the Israelites who left Egypt experienced? Absolutely, and that's the point. That's what the recipients of the Hebrew letter needed to hear. That's what we need to hear. And don't confuse that unbelief thing. Well, I believe in God. Yes, we all believe in God, but we have the same risk of departing, of sin, of disobedience that they experienced, that the Israelite experienced, that the Jews in David's time experienced, and that's why he wrote the psalm to warn them. Roger.
Well, and I think he's emphasizing here, especially even in the quote, in verse 8, do not harden your hearts. Don't have this evil, unbelieving heart. It's the examining of our thoughts and our intentions. Because very often we focus on the actual actions, but the actions come from a heart that isn't right before God.
Good. For the streamers, Roger was talking about verse 8 in chapter 3 about hardening our hearts, that we have to have those right intentions, that we have to have that those right motives in our heart, not simply the actions, which ties to the lesson that you brought this morning. Good. So, we just have, I can't drive this point home enough. Were the Israelites who left Egypt, were they God's people? And they had this risk, and they had this result. the Jews in David's time that he wrote to. Remember in verse 7, this quote, he says, today. So 450 years after they're out of Egypt, David's saying, today you have to do this. Were the Jews of David's time God's people? Did they have this same risk that they had to be reminded? The recipients of the Hebrew letter that the author is saying, look, pay attention to this example. Were they God's people? Did they have this risk? And then us today, our today, are we God's people? Do we have this risk? Okay. Anything else in chapter 3? We're going to continue to build on this and talk about the reward of it. So in chapter 4, verse 1, therefore, building on this point. Remember, these transition words are not just so that people know where to put chapter breaks. We're building on this previous point. Because they rebelled, therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear, lest any of you seem to have come short of it. For indeed this gospel was preached to us as well as to them, but the word which they heard did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in those who heard it. For we who believed do enter that rest, as he said, so I swore in my wrath they shall not enter my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again, in this place, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains that some must enter it, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter because of disobedience, again he designates a certain day, saying in David, today, after such a long time, as it has been said, today if you'll hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, and he would not afterward have spoken of another day, there remains, therefore, a rest for the people of God. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works as God did from his. Makes sense, right? We'll look at it. All right, so chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, did the Israelites ultimately wind up going into the promised land? Yeah, not that first generation, but the next generation went in. But the Hebrew writer here is saying that there's a promise that remains. So, we want to be clear what this rest that we're looking at is. So, if the Israelites ultimately went into Canaan, is the promised rest that even David's talking about in Psalm 95, is that Canaan? No, it can't be, because that's already been realized. Even in David's time, where did David write his Psalms from? Probably his house, which was in Jerusalem, which is in the promised land. So that promise has already been realized. This promised rest is not Canaan. This remaining, when you see this word remains throughout the remainder of chapter 4, think of like a reservation that you have. If I make a reservation at a restaurant, or if I make a reservation for a rental car, that's a bad example. But if I make a reservation at a restaurant and I'm not there yet, is that reservation still in existence? No. Well, if I say 7 o'clock and it's 6:30, is that reservation still there? Yeah. Does it remain? Yeah. If it's 6:59 and I haven't shown up, does that reservation still remain? Yes. But once I show up and I claim that, does that reservation remain? No, it's already been claimed. So when we see this remain, the reason I don't want to use rental cars is because they give your car away anyway. They'll keep the reservation, but the car's gone. But this promise remaining is this thing is still available. It's still out there. So this promise remains of entering his rest. Because that promise remains, let us fear. What kind of fear are we talking about here?
Well, falling short, not being able to enter the rest that was promised because of our disobedience.
What kind of fear do we have for that, though? You're right. That's what we need to be afraid of. But what is this fear? Is this what we use as a healthy respect? Roger?
I think he's referring to the idea of being fearing God and honoring God and respecting God so that you listen to God and your heart is actually right
Okay.
with God.
So that's the fear that we have of God. The Greek word for this fear is phobos. I'm not a Greek author. I've got to rely on people smarter than me. But that's the same root word that we have for our word phobia. So let's pick on Kyle and Paige. They're not here. I can pick on them if you're there. Hi. All right. Both of them have a phobia of spiders, right? How do they react when they see a spider?
It's visceral, irrational.
Well, maybe irrationally. Forrest said viscerally. Are they like, okay, well, I'll give you a bit of a wide berth?
No, it's explosive.
It's explosive? They feel it in their gut that there's this fear, right? It's a big fear. This fear that we should have about missing out on heaven, should that be a fear that maybe we feel in our gut? Now, we don't want to be irrational about it. And what Roger says is true. We don't want to have, or we want to have this healthy respect for it. But if I am at risk of turning back, if I'm at risk of disobedience because of sin and because of the hardening in our hearts that we looked at in chapter 3 last week, should I have this visceral, gut-wrenching fear of missing that rest?
It's a scary concept to think about, because when we're steadfast in our faith and we're following what we need to be following there, we're supposed to be, I don't know where it says it, but we're supposed to be confident in our salvation, right? But when you get to the point where you stumble a little bit and then it starts becoming a repetitive thing, as we talked about earlier, and I'm sure we've all experienced this at some point. It's like, holy crap, like, I really need to change this, because if I don't, then, we know what happens there, and that becomes definitely kind of a defining thing there, is to help keep us on track. There's that fear of not making that, and that really helps motivate us, or should help motivate us in the right direction.
Now, that's a good point, but let's remember who the book is written to. We've already had multiple warnings in this book. Don't be sluggish. Be diligent. Don't be lazy. In a couple of chapters, we're going to be seeing warnings about how diligent they are in their study. These are Christians who are starting to drift away from God. Should they have this healthy, gut-wrenching fear?
Yes.
Yeah, because of what they are on the brink of giving up. He's saying, you're just like those Israelites who have all these benefits of being faithful to God, and yet you're at risk of turning away like they did. That is a cause for a healthy, legitimate fear. So, because you are at that risk, therefore, that promise remains, and going back to previous chapters, you're kind of at risk. Let's fear, lest any of you seem to have come short of it, just like those Israelites. It's right there, but you're falling short of it. Verse 2, for indeed the gospel was preached to them as well, or to us as well as to them, but the word which they heard did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in those who heard it. What gospel did the Israelites have preached to them? We looked at this morning too. You might as well have taught Hebrews chapter 4. What's gospel? Sorry? Good news. That's really what it means. Did the Israelites coming out of Egypt have good news? Yeah, it's time. Promised land, remember the prophecies to Abraham? Here you go. And yet, did they realize them? No, because the word which they heard did not profit them, because it wasn't mixed with faith in those who heard it. What's the word faith? What is it? What's a substitute for the word faith? Trust. So, the word faith, it really means trust. Think about it with my kids. I can't tell my kids anything anymore. It started a long time ago that I would tell them something, and then they would have to go to their mom and say, "Mom, is this true?" And almost always, Mom would say, "No." Because they don't trust me. They can't rely on the things that I'm telling them, and that's self-inflicted. But that's what we're looking at here. These people heard God's word, and they believed in God, but they didn't have faith in the promises. They didn't trust that he was going to do what he said he was going to do, or that he was who he said he was, or that sin is what sin is. That lack of trust means I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm not going to rely on this. So the gospel, they had good news, we have good news, we've got it just like they do, but it doesn't benefit if there's no trust involved. And separate this belief in the entity of God from trust in what God says. There's a big difference in those two. Verse 3, "For we who have believed do enter that rest. As he has said, I swore in my wrath, they won't enter my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world." So, we can realize that rest, just even though they couldn't. And the reason they couldn't was on them, not because it wasn't ready yet. That's the point here in verse 3, that he says this rest that they were promised, it was ready. It was ready and waiting for them. It was that reservation that they didn't claim. It was ready from the foundation of the world. They didn't get it. It still remains. We have an opportunity for it. Verse 4, and this is where he's talking about that rest and how it was available since the foundation of the world. "For he, God, has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works." And again, in this place, "They won't enter my rest." So verse 4, what's this rest on the seventh day that God's talking about? That God rested on the seventh day from all his works. What's that rest? I heard a voice. Creation. Okay. I hear Sabbath. What does the word Sabbath mean? It means rest. So some versions, and most of them are older versions in here, might have sprinkled out throughout this passage rest or Sabbath rest. So if you see Sabbath rest, it just means rest. And that's the risk when we see in verse 4 of chapter 4, when we see God rested from the seventh day, or God rested on the seventh day from all his works, we're thinking Sabbath. We're thinking the Sabbath law that was a commandment given to the Old Testament Jews, that you don't do any work on the seventh day because God rested on the seventh day, which is legitimate and accurate, but I don't think that's what it means here. Roger.
I hate to kind of change something, but what you said there is rest here. There's actually two words used for rest in this passage. Most of them are Greek word that doesn't refer to the Sabbath. It's referring to it conceptually, to the idea of the Sabbath rest. But it's a word for rest, just means rest. But in verse 9, he actually is uses a different word, which means the Sabbath. And so he uses a different Greek word there about the Sabbath rest that remains for the people of God.
In verse 9?
In verse 9. So just a little note that there is some play on rest here.
Okay.
In the Greek words.
That's a good point. Again, not a Greek scholar, but I don't think it changes the
No, it doesn't.
message is given.
Yeah, it doesn't change the basic message of what he's talking about, comparing the concept of the Sabbath of the Old Testament with what he's trying to get us to see, that all of us have this Sabbath rest available to us that is out there.
Okay.
And is that the question that we're asking here? Is
No.
What is that Sabbath rest?
What I want to do is I want to separate the thought of what we see in verse 4 of God resting on the seventh day and associating that with a weekly Sabbath. Because this section can be used by a lot of Seventh-day Adventists. saying that the Hebrew author says there's a Sabbath that remains, meaning we need to be resting on the seventh day of the week. Now, which is misapplication, because the Sabbath commandment, it gives it away. The Sabbath that we read of in the Old Law, the Ten Commandments, is a commandment. That Sabbath commandment, you won't do any work. But we see in chapter 4, verse 1, this rest, this Sabbath that we're talking about here, is a promise. Is there a difference between a commandment and a promise? Yeah. The Sabbath commandment, don't do any work, meditate on God, is under the Old Law, that's a different than this promise that we have that remains. So maybe I'm a little sensitive to it, to just separate the idea that some Seventh-day Adventists use this passage to talk about, the Sabbath and the new law is still legitimate. That's not the rest we're talking about. And we'll go back in a few minutes and look at this in all those verses. So when God rests, in verse 4, quoting Genesis chapter 2, and God rested in the seventh day from all his works. What has God been doing day 1 through 6? Creating. Now on day 7, he rests, right? What does he do on day 8? Does he go back to creating? Or is creating done?
Now it's about managing.
Creating is done. So when God rests on the seventh day, is he doing absolutely nothing?
It's
No,
probably,
he's working. He's working again.
He's working, but he's not creating anymore. So when we read this, this is how I think about verse 4. When God rests on the seventh day, he's done with creation. I built it, it's done, I'm not going back to that. And he's resting from creation. And that counts for day 8 and day 9 and day 10 and day 11. He's not going back to make creation anymore because he's made creation, and that's what he's resting from. We see it, and we think seventh day of the week, like we see in the Old Law, that we work days 1 through 6, we rest on day 7, day 8, we pick up and start working again. He's not talking about day 7 of the week, I think here in verse 4. He's talking about day 7 of existence, day 7 of creation. That on that day, God's done with creation, and he's not going to go back to it again. And we'll look at that as we get farther into this. I think that's the rest that we're promised that the Israelites who came out of Egypt didn't get. It's that eternal rest, that eternal being done with this work. So that's what we have in verse 4. God rested on the seventh day from all his works. Verse 5, and again in this place, they don't get it. They're not going to enter my rest. Verse 6, since therefore, because it's unclaimed, since therefore it remains, that reservation still available, that some must enter it, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter because of disobedience, lack of faith, lack of trust, sin, this disobedience. Again, he designates a certain day, saying in David, today, after such a long time as it's been said, today if you'll hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. So, that promise of eternal rest, was that available to the Israelites who came out of Egypt?
yes.
Yes. That promise, that same promise of eternal rest, was that available to the Jews in David's day? Yes. And that's the point of why he keeps saying this word today, today, today. He's going back to that quote that we start seeing here in chapter 3, verse 7, where it says, today, if you'll hear his voice, all through that, and at the end of verse 11, so they don't get to enter my rest. David saying, today, that rest is still available. And the Hebrew author is saying, today, that rest is still available. So that's what he's talking about in verse 7. Again, he designates a certain day, saying, in David today, even though it's been 450 years, even though it's been all this time, this rest, this reservation, it remains. It's still available. Any questions on that section, that piece? Okay. Verse 8. For if Joshua had given them rest, then they would not afterward have spoken of another day. Does anyone have a different name other than Joshua?
Jesus.
Okay. Was Jesus failing in giving a rest? Which says no. This is the thing in Greek, that the name Joshua and the name Jesus are either really, really similar or they're the same. So the context has to determine whether we're talking about Joshua or whether we're talking about Jesus. Now, we see this in Stephen's defense to the council in Acts chapter 7, verse 45. Stephen uses this same word talking about Joshua leading the people into the promised land. He's not talking about Jesus leading them into the promised land, but it's the same name. So in Stephen's defense, the context determines that he's talking about Joshua, who followed up Moses, not Jesus, who is the Son of God. So when we see in verse 8, for if Joshua had given them rest, then they wouldn't have spoken of another day. Remember, David's talking about, the author here is quoting David, who's talking about the Israelites coming out of Egypt. And they got to go into Canaan under the leadership of Joshua. Context is talking about Joshua. I don't think he's talking about Jesus somehow messed up and didn't give them the rest that had been prophesied. That doesn't fit the context, and that frankly doesn't fit what we read about Jesus. Any questions or comments about Joshua, Jesus, in verse 8? Roger?
Oh, not the Joshua Jesus part.
So Roger's got something else. Before then, are we okay? Are we clear on the Joshua Jesus thing? That I don't want to risk any confusion there, because I really don't want to undercut any confidence that we have in Jesus being exactly who he was supposed to be. Okay, Roger.
I think, because in the whole book, too, it kind of expands this idea a lot, that the idea of the promised land is the rest being referred to here. So all through here, Joshua, when they went into the promised land, that wasn't the real rest. But it is a foreshadowing of the rest. So the promised land foreshadows the rest of God's people, so that we get to rest from our works like God rested from his works. And the promised land, but also not just the promised land, but also the holy hill, the mountain, the New Jerusalem. All of those concepts, they flow actually in the whole book, so that Abraham, he didn't see it right. He didn't get the promise, and he was still looking for the city, to get the promise. And so all of that rest, all of that concept, all of those Sabbath concepts are being rolled here throughout the whole book, and not just here where he's using rest, but all through the book when he's going to later on talk about the promised land or things like that, talking about how we still look forward to this rest that God has promised his people.
Right. And it's important to see what we're resting from. We already talked about God created day 1 through 6, not of the week, but of creation. On day 7, he rested from that work, right? So if the promised land was a rest to the people under Moses and a rest to the people under Joshua, did that mean they didn't have to work after they got into Canaan?
No, it's more of a relief from what they had previously.
It's a rest from. Did they have to wander anymore? No, it's a rest from that. Did they have to fight to conquer anymore? No, it's a rest from that. So when we look forward to our rest, our hope, that expectation of heaven, that rest that we have, that means all this garbage that we put up with on the world, we're done with that work. Now, are we still serving and praising in heaven? Yeah, there's a lot of, I don't know exactly what it's like, but I'm assuming there's stuff to do. It's different than what we have here. It's going to be our rest from what we have here. Roger, do you have a hand up? Okay. So, verse 8, if Joshua had given him rest, if Canaan was that answer, then we wouldn't be talking about another one. Verse 9, there remains therefore a rest for the people of God. We're not talking about what Joshua gave them. We've got something else that remains. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works as God did from his. So whoever realizes this rest, whoever gets this rest, it has ceased from their works. And we know that that only comes in heaven. I want to look quickly, just in this section, there's so many references to rest, and we're using the Israelites and the Promised Land as a antitype or as an example, as a foreshadowing. I've got 4 points here and the verses that support them. So number 1, God rested from his labor. We see that in verse 4, and we see that in verse 10. He created, he was done, he rested. Now, the second point is he prepared that rest where you're done working and you get to rest. You get to be completely done with it. He prepared that rest for his people. And we see that in verse 3, we see that in verse 4, and we see that in verse 5. Now, the Israelites were disobedient. Therefore, they didn't get that rest of being done. And we see that in chapter 6, and we see that in verse 6 and verse 8. And therefore, that rest still remains. It's still available to the people of God. And we see that in verses 6, 7, 8, and 9. So that rest that God has, I'm complete, I'm done, I'm finished with my work. That's the rest that we're promised. And that's the rest that we're being warned against losing because of lack of diligence, lack of trust, not paying attention and drifting away. And we'll see more about how we need to be more thorough in the Word in future chapters. But that's that risk that that rest that we're at risk of losing. And we'll see next week when we picked up in verse 11 how we need to be diligent. Just a reminder that we're at risk there. Anything through chapter 4, verse 10? All right, we'll pick up in verse 11 next week. Let's have a quick prayer, and then we can go. Father, we humbly come to you, thanking you for all you've done for us, for providing heaven for us, where we can rest. And we're grateful that you've given us your word so that you can guide us into how we need to live this life so we can have that reward. We ask that we would be diligent in our lives, that we'd be faithful to you, that we'd focus on you and trust in what you say, that we can have that rest when we're done here. Help us encourage one another, to guide one another, to build each other up, to teach each other, to help each other through this life. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.